My name is Alec Murphy. I'm a professor of geography at the University of Oregon and the president of the Roundtable Club of Eugene this year. The Roundtable Club of Eugene was founded 100 years ago for the social and intellectual benefit of its membership. It's a remarkable organization. I don't really know of any other organization quite like it anywhere else, and it's been around for 100 years. It plays at least two important roles. One is to facilitate good town-gown relations. Any community that has a university needs good town-gown relations, and bringing together community and university leaders can facilitate good dialogue and interaction on either side of that coin. It's also an organization where people can learn from each other. Community members learn from faculty, faculty learn from community members, and promoting the kind of dialogue that exists across our annual dinners, our monthly dinners, and the interactions we have over the papers that are delivered is something that is enriching to all of us. So the Roundtable Club of Eugene is something that's been a remarkable asset to our community and our university over the last 100 years, and we look forward to another 100 years when it will continue to play that role.
My goal tonight was to summarize the papers of the Roundtable Club delivered by its members during the first decade of its existence, 1913 through 1920. It was a period at the height of the American Progressive period, when whiskey was $3.50 a gallon and milk and gasoline was 32 cents a gallon. It was a decade which began with the opening of the Osborne Hotel here in Eugene, where many of the roundtable meetings of that era were held. The first paper ever delivered at Roundtable was in January 1913 by William Parsons, who was then the minister of the local First Presbyterian Central Church. His paper, entitled The Catholic Church from the Protestant Perspective, came at a time when there was growing public suspicion and distrust of Catholicism in the state of Oregon. The titles of the other papers delivered during this decade showed a serious interest in five particular areas: crime and punishment in prisons, psychiatry, heredity and eugenics, medicine, and the communities of Lane County and the city of Eugene. The Roundtable Minutes also provide a history of the early growth and operation of the club. By the end of 1916, Roundtable's membership had grown to about 35 members, which were equally divided between the town members and the gown members. Meetings often began at 6:15 and lasted well into the evening, as long as to 10:30 at night. While World War I barely influenced the subject matter of papers given in this era, it greatly impacted the price of membership in the club. 4 days after the United States entered the war, the club voted to reduce the prices of its meals as well as its membership. Meals went from 75 cents to 50 cents. Membership declined from $5 to $3.50 a year. Roundtable members in the armed forces were excused for paying dues while they were in the service. In January of 1918, the club adopted a meatless meals policy following the suggestion of the United States Food Administration. One of the last papers delivered by the club during this period was reflective of a subject that remains of great importance and interest to the Roundtable membership. That paper, given in November of 1920, was entitled Oregon Football. While we don't have access to the actual content of the papers from this decade, their titles clearly show that they were varied, of great interest, and likely reflective of the prevailing opinions and deemed of importance by the members at the time.
The Roundtable Club had its 10th anniversary in the fall of 1922. The university president at the time, Prince Lucian Campbell, had by then presented 2 papers to the Round Table, one in 1913, the other in 1920. Neither of these papers remains in the university's collection. In fact, nobody's papers remain from the teens, and only one paper remains from the 20s. The sole surviving paper in the 20s was by geology professor Warren Dupree Smith. It was delivered by him on December 12, 1922, and the meeting would have been at the Osborne Hotel at 8th and Pearl, where they met for the first 3 decades. His paper was entitled "The Philippine Situation as Viewed by a Geologist," and it has to do with political uncertainty in the Philippines, which the United States had purchased from Spain only 20 years before. It's too bad there weren't other papers from the 20s, because its clear members even then had a very wide range of interests. And you can tell from the titles that are recorded in the minutes of the club, and here are a few examples. "The Energy Problem of the Future," "Legal and Sociological Aspects of Anti-Evolution Laws," "Interesting Byways in Oregon," "Mathematics at Work and at Play," "History of the Feminist Movement." All of these delivered by men, of course. One wonders what Professor Smith would have said to the news that in 75 years a woman would for the first time present her paper to the Round Table Club. I hope he'd approve.
The Round Table Club met regularly during the 1930s, despite being during the time of the Great Depression. During that time, there was only scant mention made of the economic troubles of our nation, either in the minutes of the Round Table Club or in the papers that were given. Wayne Morse, who later became United States Senator, was secretary of the club during part of that decade. There were many outstanding papers given during that time, some papers with considerable foresight and some papers without foresight. An example of the latter was a paper given titled "Why We Make Eugene Our Home," and the author included the statement, "I believe in Eugene because she has a supply of timber that will give me a job forever." On April 12, 1936, Fred Cuthbert, yes, our amphitheater's namesake, presented his paper, "Recent Trends in City Planning," and made considerable argument for professional city planners as opposed to politicians posing as city planners. I am a physician, so naturally my attention was drawn to a paper given by Dr. Arthur H. Norton on the evening of April 13, 1937. Titled "The Medical Situation as I See It," Dr. Norton gave a thorough review of the status of healthcare delivery in 1937. With unassuming foresight, the doctor wrote, and I would like to quote, "Under an insurance plan, it is likely that many receiving charity because unable to pay for a major illness would be able to make the smaller payments required by an insurance plan and stay off relief rolls. I would like to see the profession so organized that all who desire might be cared for this way. We are told," Dr. Norton wrote, "that a voluntary insurance scheme will not work, and that eventually it must become compulsory," unquote. Those words echo this very day in our national debate about healthcare delivery.
During the decades of the 40s, the Round Table of Eugene was a fully subscribed, vibrant club with the presentation of many well-researched and erudite papers on personal, local, national, and international issues. Some of these papers, while the facts have changed, are as relevant today as they were when first presented 60 or 70 years ago. Papers of personal interest included topics of roses, sustainable forests, cataracts, retirement, Leonardo da Vinci, and the validity of Reno divorces, to name a few. Papers of local interest included city architecture, local taxation, and the history of Oregon, journalism. A particular interest to me is a paper relevant today in this election season. It was given by James Gilbert in 1941, entitled "Progressive Taxation in Theory and Practice." Informed us that incomes over $5 million, $78 million today, were taxed at 79%. And that these taxes, quote, were not used to get the rich to pay out a proportion to their ability, but to get them to pay in proportion to their ability. And finally, in 1943, a paper entitled Internationalism Through Science ended with a quote from Goethe: "It is not enough to know, it is necessary to apply knowledge. It is not enough to will, it is necessary to act." That was a paper presented by Pierre van Rysselberghe, who is the father of our current member. So finally, as the 40s ended, the Round Table of Eugene was a prestigious club in good hands.
The first decade after World War II brought us the baby boom, the interstate highway system, the shift from radio to television, advances in medicine, science, and technology, the first satellite, the first copy machine, the polio vaccine, and Crick and Watson discovered the secrets of DNA. The specter of communism hung over the decade, and the roles of women were changing. Home ownership increased as Americans moved to the suburbs. America also began to confront its racist past, and the fight to end segregation was joined. The papers given during the decade reflected these changes. Eugene Mayor V. Edwin Johnson gave a paper entitled The Mayor Talks, Your Municipal Government. He talked about recent annexations, the creation of Mahlon Sweet Airport, and the budget. George Turnbull gave a paper whose title one might expect today: Newspapers, Their Past, Present, and Future, if any. His concern for the future of newspapers was based upon competition and the lack of journalistic diligence. And in February 1952, Hiram Overstreet presented a paper entitled Little Killers, in which he talked about viruses and the medical advances used to combat them. There were two papers given on Israel, one by Vance Webster entitled Keep Your Eye on Israel. He was very pro-Israel. The other, entitled Pity the Arab by Wesley Gordon Nicholson, was very sympathetic to the plight of the people who we now know as Palestinians. The final paper of the decade was presented on May 12, 1959. It was the 390th meeting of the Round Table. It was held at the First Congregational Church. Fred L. Stetson presented a paper entitled The American Family Has Headaches. The paper explored the challenges to the family created by finances and the relationship with children. He suggested that not all parents were qualified for the job. As evidence of the fact, he cited the increase in antisocial activity by youth. In short, the papers presented during the 50s were a mirror of the issues of the day, from Marxism, Israel, military security, education, the family, race relations, and the pressure of suburbia on local government.
The 1960s was the Cold War era, and America was in a space race with Russia. It was an era of technological innovation, and the first computers and other inventions revolutionized manufacturing and business. Medical breakthroughs like contact lenses and heart transplants made it seem as though science could solve all our problems. So it was an era of optimism. The growth of the suburbs, the federal highway system changed the entire landscape. The decade was also marked by rising expectations for social justice, the civil rights movement, the free speech movement, the women's liberation movement all had their birth during this decade. At the same time, there was great upheaval and tragedy, the assassinations of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King. The student protest movement, open sexual expression, and hippie culture explicitly rejected materialism and challenged authority, especially near the end of the decade. In the 1960s, the Round Table Club was still all male, and with the exception of a few papers delivered in May on Ladies' Night, the papers did not address women nor tackle women's issues. The papers were mostly very serious and included the usual mix of professional expertise, hobbies, and current events,
with talks ranging from beekeeping to magic tricks. Notable papers were delivered by Bill Bowerman in 1961 on his ideas about training, biomechanics, and very light track shoes, and from Wayne Morse in 1966 on the history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, which he called illegal. But by far the largest number of papers focused, at least in part, on anxiety about the changing times and the turmoil linked to what has now become known as the generation gap. The best example of this is a paper by Ray Lowe, professor of education, entitled Parents and Children in Conflict, delivered on February 11, 1964. He pointed out that cultural changes were undermining parents' ability to teach their children or instill in them the values they would need to live in a changing world. He made the case that the accelerated growth of technology was transforming the workplace and therefore jobs, and that the growth of big business, big government, and cities and suburbs were all undermining the authority of the older institutions upon which we depended, things like schools, families, churches. He worried about growing individualism, but he also saw opportunity for the growth of what he called a society of equals in three important areas. The first, minorities and majorities, what we would now call racial equality. The second, men and women, what we would call gender equity. And the third, children and parents. He talked about how parents vacillate between autocratic parenting, the old style, and permissive parenting, a topic about which many of the Roundtable Club members did quite a bit of hand-wringing. The amazing thing to me is that the issues that he talked about permeated all of the papers that year and are still with us now, 5 decades later.
Yes, indeed, Roundtable Club. Been around for 100 years. A unique organization that in 1972 only had men in it, of course, but still it was a time that intrigued me because the 1970s is when I came of age in some ways. I graduated high school in 1972. So I found a paper from 1972 written by a Roundtable member named William H. Byrd, the topic of which had to do with his work at the university. He was the director of the Outward Bound program. His paper concerns what he sees as the problem with a culture becoming too staid and too averse to risk. He called his paper Danger as a Way of Joy. And besides looking at what he presciently predicted would be finding the chemical basis of the joy and the exhilaration we feel when we do something risky. He also feared that our continually more risk-averse culture, the fact that kids were sitting and watching movies rather than going out river rafting, would make for a less inventive, less interesting, less culturally and humanly vibrant community, and one where people would not be discovering themselves. He clearly saw discovering yourself as something that comes from taking risks. So he's a guy who would not have been in favor of warning labels on everything. And he was a guy who was clearly talking to parents as much as to kids. And now the kids he would have been talking to, like me, who was probably watching movies much more than going out and whitewater rafting, especially living in New Jersey. He would have recommended that I be somebody out there river rafting. But not only that, this was 1972. He was talking to the parents of kids like me, but now I'm a parent. So as a parent, my responsibility, as William H. Byrd tells me, is to nurture that next generation in a way that does want my kids to go out and do something risky. Without risk, you get nowhere. That's the message of William H. Byrd, and I thank him for giving me this message back in 1972 and today.
Change was on the menu for the Roundtable Club in the 1980s. The change didn't actually arrive until the decade later, but it was on the menu, and so people were talking about it a lot in the 1980s. In 1983, the club moved their dinners from the Valley River Inn to the Hilton, and then the very next month they moved back to Valley River Inn. In 1985, Valley River Inn made a big mistake because they served lasagna to the members that were there on time, and then when some other people showed up late, they got steak, and that was a big concern for the members. It was such a big deal that the Valley River Inn comped the meals for that month, recognizing that they had inadvertently rewarded people for showing up late. In 1988, the club moved their dinners to the town club and stayed there, I think, until the town club closed. This was a decade when people were thinking long. They were considering how history was taking shape and where they were located in that history. And I'm bringing you 3 papers in quick summary about that long stretch. First, James Kays in 1987 looked back on what had happened in the 75 years since the club's inception. And he came up with 4 big changes that were notable that he talked about at length with great precision. Number 1, the Depression. Number 2, Hitler. Number 3, the speed of travel, air travel and car travel both. And number 4, antibiotics. His takeaway, and I'm quoting, "We can now inoculate ourselves against virtually everything except ourselves." In 1985, Robert Bennett looked in the opposite direction. His paper of the year, entitled "Shall We Go Together?", speculated on the, quote, leading candidates for serious problems that will not go away with time. A final cataclysm is what he contemplated, and he offered 3 dismal alternatives. Number 1, the burning out of the sun. I told you he was thinking long term. Number 2, a planetary collision with a large object. And number 3, the one that he was most concerned about and thought might be the most certain, an entrapment in a collapsing universe. Here's Bennett's takeaway. Looking ahead a long way gives us perspective as to what to do this week and next year. The third paper I want to tell you about involves Ruth Bascom. Ruth Bascom was part of the program in May of 1984, but she was only there to play the piano. Dr. John Bascom delivered a paper imagining what the Pacific Northwest looked like from the perspective of a glacier. So 10,000 years is like a day. Royal Awards are the people who have made these for the club since the 1990s. So the 1980s were the last year that we did not have these.
Well, when I joined the Roundtable in 1988, there were 3 major attributes that stood out in my mind. One was the fact that all of the club members were community leaders or university leaders. Another was that it was a men's-only club. There were no women allowed. And the third attribute was the fact that all the members used to go to the monthly dinner wearing suits and ties. Well, only one of those attributes has survived into the 21st century. The fact that the members are leaders in their fields still exists, but many of the men now come to dinner in more casual clothing, and thankfully, we now have women members, many of them. But it was really a struggle to get the club to change its rules and admit women. It took many, many years of effort. And finally, when I was vice president in 1995, the two-thirds majority vote we needed was finally achieved. Prominent figures who led that victory included Duck President Dave Frohnmeyer, for one. And the opposition included prominent figures also, such as Bill Bowerman and Orlando Hollis. They and several others resigned after the membership rule was changed to admit women. When I became president in 1995-96, we inducted our first women members, including some prominent leaders like Mayor Ruth Bascom, a TV magnate Carolyn Chambers, and Sister Barbara Haas. To me, this was the hallmark in the Round Table Club's modern history, and I'm serious about that. But there's one more thing I'd like to mention as standing out in my mind during my 24 years as a member. And that's what I consider by far the best member paper delivered during those years. It was presented by Dan Williams, and the paper was titled Tyranny or Democracy. It examined the Oregon Initiative process, which was one of the first in the nation, and in a truly profound manner, it concluded that the initiative was no longer a bastion of democracy, as it was intended to be, but rather an invitation for political influence by big money special interests. He made a point that really stuck with me.
First, I should explain why I'm giving the explanation of the Round Table Club's history from 2002 to 2012 and not our 100th president, Ann Dumac Lucas. Ann died tragically recently as the 99th president. I'm stepping in even though that's not really possible. But I'd say in this last decade, what was most important in the Round Table Club, I mean, we shifted location and made some changes, but the main one was the internet and the use of graphics. And this is more controversial than you might think, because at first people just did PowerPoint presentations with bulleted lists, and there was a rule to not allow that at all. And yet graphics have become increasingly important and now allowed. And one example of this is Jim Earle's paper on called From My Window Seat. Now, he's a professor of medieval studies, but in traveling around the country by plane, he'd notice out the window the patterns of the farms, often these giant agricultural circles that form strange abstract patterns. And then using Google Earth, he'd make large canvases of these and framed them as artwork and gave a talk about whether this is art. He didn't actually paint these himself. And it made a paper that you had to see. You had to have graphics for it. And then later was his graphics won the Mayor's Art Award and became a major exhibition at the Eugene Airport. So graphics and the internet have been important, but we continue our tradition of researching interesting and important topics. And Dom Monahan did a couple of papers about that in this last decade. One about the persecution of Chinese immigrants in Oregon. There were laws restricting their what they could do and forcing them to go back to China. persecuting them anyways. And then another paper about eugenics, in which he discussed how patients at the Oregon Mental Hospital and the penitentiary had been forcibly sterilized as part of a program to improve the genetics and the tragedy that surrounded that. We're still discussing important issues, but I think the biggest change that we're facing is the decline of clubbism. 100 years ago, everyone belonged to clubs, and the face-to-face meetings were ordinary. And now, with the rise of social networking and Facebook and all, this is less common. And you really lose something when you lose that, because there is no substitute for sitting down at dinner and discussing with real live people important issues and having and connecting brain to brain with important thinkers in your community, both at the university and in the town.
This is my best imitation of Michael Moore. Let's go in and meet them. Hi, Doreen.
Hi.
I'm here from the Round Table Club.
Okay.
And do these look familiar to you?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Are they made here?
They are, yes, and have been for quite a while.
Do you have something to show us of how they get made, or
Sure.
something?
Sure, actually.